Hello and welcome to the Choirlosophy Podcast. This is episode 131, Going Beyond Good Intentions with Robyn Hilger. In part 2 of my conversation with ACDA Executive Director Robyn Hilger, we pick up right where we left off last week in episode 130. I begin by asking Robyn about the ACDA National Convention's session lineup. We discuss what is there and what is missing. We move from there into a deep discussion of ACDA's diversity initiatives and how we would measure success or progress. At what point does the intersectionality of our diverse membership simply become unique individuals with unique wants and needs? How does a large membership organization respond to this challenge? For example, a recent region conference had all-male conductors on the slate. What no one knows is whether or not we had a diverse pool to choose from, because we weren't collecting the data. This matters because you have to understand the problems in order to solve them. We discuss this and the idea that I call Trickle Down Social Justice. Are we focused on composers on the program or who conducts at conventions, and that's it? Or are we focused on the lack of equity in music training for fourth graders? I think this could be a bias towards what's visible. The fourth graders aren't visible because they've never been trained. We go into this and many more things. I even subject Robyn towards the end of the episode, about 40 minutes in, to my controversial beliefs about race being a social construct and what problems that can cause when we use language that makes it seem more real within the organization. This was just a jam-packed conversation. There is so much here. So I encourage you, if you don't normally listen to the whole podcast, when you listen to podcasts, you don't want to miss this. This one goes hot and heavy all the way to the end. And guys, I trimmed a lot. Robyn and I talked for 3 hours with the tape on. We went to the bar afterwards and talked for hours and hours more. So you're getting just the most salient bits of this, and for folks on my Patreon, I'm going to do a recap of the entire experience for just Patreon subscribers only on the private podcast feed there. It is my strong belief that there is not a better tool out there for teaching music literacy than SightReadingFactory.com. Now, the way that you use it matters. That being said, it is so efficient, so easy, and so cost-effective that I strongly recommend that everybody goes and signs up for it. If you have not already, get a membership for every single one of your students. And I don't care what level of choir you work with. It's usable and helpful for everybody. So go to SightReadingFactory.com. When you get all of your membership, enter Choirlosophy at checkout. Every time you renew, you'll get 10% off. And of course, don't forget to head over to Choirlosophy Patreon group, which is patreon.com/Choirlosophy, and sign up for $3 a month or more and support financially the recurring costs of doing the show. It really, really helps a lot. The producers at Patreon are Brannigan Lawrence, Brian Long, Venture Studios, John Warner, Jonah Clixbull, Ulrika Igrain, Munoz Alarcon, Angie Schilling, David Kowalczyk, James Mock, Jared Hendricks, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Nathan Hines, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. I see this. Okay, so we got a new one, which is to engage, listen, and learn from marginalized and historically underrepresented groups in order to create a new and more inclusive future for all. I see a lot of that at the convention, but I don't see a lot of the other stuff. So a lot of these other points. So I think there's.
So I actually think you see a lot of the other points, but you don't see the points that are important to you. So I want to revisit
to a
this.
lot of people.
Well,
yeah.
As the current chief spokesperson
Yep.
for vocal ped
Yep.
and literacy.
Yes.
So I actually think that there's something to that, right? And so when we start thinking about how are the decisions made to get things onto the national program or any conference program? So the adjudication process with an ACDA is through the R&Rs. Where does vocal ped fit in the current R&R structure?
Probably nowhere.
Where does literacy fit?
Well, it probably. I mean, that's my point.
Right,
it
but
doesn't.
that's what I'm saying.
Right.
Is we don't have to wonder.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
We don't have to maybe wonder why that happens. Now, just because there's not a home today doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be
right.
a home. And I think that ACDA has already seen an organizational change, which tells you about the capacity for this. So, for example, before the national standing committees, the R&Rs were the only structure that existed, right? Repertoire and resources and the national board. And then I don't know when the standing committees were implemented, but they're not that old. Less than 10 years old. This was what I would say, less than 10 years old, probably 6 or 7 years old.
Yeah.
So that's when you saw the growth of the Advocacy and Collaboration Committee, the DIC, the Composition Initiatives Committee, the Education, the International Activities Standing Committee, right? This is where, because there was no home within the R&R structure for those things. So I think what you're talking about is there are identified gaps, and what we need to be thinking about is where do those subjects or topics begin to live? I mean, as a music teacher, I fundamentally know that, like, for example, the teaching of literacy, music literacy, is fundamental to instrumental music education, right? Like,
Wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Correct.
In instrumental music.
Correct.
Yeah.
The vocal ped thing is interesting to me, and I think that it potentially is linked to the higher ed structure, which, by the way, I think it's worthy to say that from a historical standpoint, ACDA, by the way, there's a book about this written by Marvin Latimer. It was published just before COVID.
I remember you telling me about this.
Okay,
Yeah.
you can get it on Amazon. It's the history of ACDA. Hillary Appleschott sent it to me on like the day I signed my contract. She sent me a copy. And it's amazing because, for example, one of the things that people don't know about ACDA is we didn't start as a membership organization. Our founding is in the format of the American Bandmasters Association.
Okay.
Which the American Bandmasters Association has never become a membership association. They tell you if you can be a member. You are elected into membership of the American Bandmasters Association.
Okay, very fancy.
Today, even today, look it up.
It's like a country club.
For band directors, it is. The founding of ACDA is in that tradition, is in the American Bandmasters tradition. And at some point, we took this little kick over into being a membership organization, open membership, but it also was rooted completely within collegiate teaching. There was no foundation outside of that. By the way, there were no minority people either. There were no, right? So we don't have to ask ourselves, why are there some of these vestiges that are here? It's in the founding of the organization. I think in the, 63, 64 years old, that the organization has already transformed kind of multiple times. And I think that tells us a lot about our capacity to continue to iterate, right? What is the next iteration? Because we have to move as fast as the field is moving. And here's what we know. The field is moving very fast, right?
Yeah.
Has ACDA been that nimble prior? I haven't been here. I couldn't tell you. But I will tell you that anybody who has been on any project with me will tell you that I'm an iterative process person. So I don't ever think the work is done. And I'm always looking for what is next on the horizon. That is who I am as an administrator. And so that's the spirit that I am bringing to the work. I don't get any pushback from anybody saying like, no, we shouldn't have these conversations. And so I think it's worthy to say, for example, if you're in college, vocal ped may not be as important to you because you have voice faculty who are serving that with the students that you're teaching. But teaching students to care for their voice could be incredibly important when you're the one-person show. Mm-hmm. And you have to be all things to all people.
Right.
Right?
Well, there are a lot
and that's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, and there are a lot of colleagues that get thrown into the choir program at their school who they're instrumental majors. Mm-hmm. And they've never been taught anything about the voice, not even from their own voice lessons. They don't know anything. And that's oftentimes, then they become a member of ACDA hoping that they're going to get some help in that area, and then there's nothing there. But it's one of those things where, I don't disagree with any of those thought processes that you're putting us through right now, because I think that's exactly where my critique is coming from, which is the idea that I understand kind of historically why it is the way it is, but essentially coming from the standpoint of we know more now than we did then about there's a lot of things we know more about. In the 90s, we started to actually understand how the voice works because we had the technology to actually see it and get the camera down the throat and figure out what's actually happening. So there's a lot of things that if you're somebody my age, you could be a choir director and make a reasonable argument that you didn't really need to know the science of how the voice works because there wasn't any. And it was all being taught with imagery and sing like a fluffy cloud and like all this kind of stuff, and which never would have flown in instrumental music. You can't you can't just say push some of the button thingies and like and that's essentially we operated in choral music on that level for quite a while. In the same way, it's why I'm pushing. That's why I have this vocal ped literacy thing as my crusade, because we also know things now about the brain that we didn't know when I became a teacher, about what is going on inside of a kid's brain when they're trying to learn how to read music and how beneficial that is to them. And so and then I meet the reality of colleagues that say, well, but what causes me the most pain points in my day? It's that I can't get the kids to sound the way I want them to sound, and I can't get them to learn the music the way that they want to learn music, and I feel like I don't know, I don't have any resources for that. And so when I make this argument about the convention, that's kind of where it comes from. Mm-hmm. It's from the idea that I recognize that we serve our constituents best when we are able to educate them best. And it was kind of like the conversation you and I were having before I turned the camera on and the mic's on about, like, are we choir directors or are we educators or are we both? Mm-hmm. And what does it mean when we use those terms? And of course, our organization is the American Choral Directors Association. We are not NAFME, but at the same time, maybe we could incorporate a little bit more of the educator side of it into it, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. And I especially think about, like, again, in fact, I'll just tell you, I don't think I've really talked about this on the show at all. Is that I submitted a proposal for a presentation at National. Okay. The title of the presentation was Literacy is Equity. And it got rejected. And it got rejected on the grounds, the comments of the adjudicators were fascinating to me. Because one was, my presentation was going to be basically the science of reading and how we read and how to best deliver that instruction to kids. That's something I'm very good at, and because I've worked at it and I've studied it. And then also trying to make to fit the presentation, though, into the rubric for the convention, which you needed to make the case that you were serving underrepresented populations in a roundabout way. And I've believed that for years, that one of the ways that you give a kid who doesn't have a leg up is you give them a good education. Mm-hmm. That is, and because I can't solve society's problems for the kids that are in my classroom, I cannot make the world equal, but I can give that kid tools mm-hmm. that can pull them out of all kinds of situations. And essentially that was going to be my presentation, was not only how to do it well, but why it matters for the very kids that we are most concerned about access and equity and their ability to function and help create the world that we're hoping to see. And what was interesting about the response to that was that, But not all cultures learn music by reading. So shouldn't we have part of that in the presentation? And maybe you should think about that next time.
Like notation isn't...
It isn't how everybody learns music. And that was one of the reasons that it didn't get accepted. That was one of the responses. And that was fascinating to me because it really highlights a type of response that I hear a lot. And again, one of those that wouldn't come up in instrumental music, right? It would be like... you play the bassoon, you can play bassoon by all kinds of composers from all over the world, but they're all going to need to know how to read the music in order to play it.
So you're going to find this fascinating. So in our Sistema program here, we started our kids from an aural base. Okay? Everybody's singing solfege. We did not teach note names from the get-go. We taught, this is do, this is re, this is mi, the kids sang. You would have thought that from an instrumental standpoint, of course, what you hear when you do this in an instrumental classroom is they'll never learn to read.
Yeah.
That's not actually how it works.
Right.
Once they can audiate the pattern, you can sing nonsense syllables, they can sing the solfege back to you. The second that can happen, they're ready to read. But here's the other thing that happens. Your orchestra never plays out of tune because they know exactly what it should sound like. I mean exactly what it should sound like. I would have been in the disbelievers camp a decade ago on this issue in an instrumental classroom. The amount of times that I've had to correct an F sharp to an F natural, if I had a penny for every time I'd quit this job, I wouldn't need this job if I had to correct that. We never, I mean virtually never had to have that conversation on our campus because the kids knew what minor sounded like, what major sounded like, but they knew instantaneously. They would fix it themselves before you even had to talk about it.
Giving them tools.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of the opposite. Like, again, it was a little bit like, oh, look at them over there doing this crazy thing where their kids are going to sing first. You can't, the results are undeniable. That's what I would tell you about it. You can think whatever you want about the process, but the outcome can't really argue with. So, you know, but again, Chris, this goes back to like when I hear about adjudication and all of those things. Let's talk about the rubric for a second. I actually brought a copy.
Yeah.
Because, so this was fascinating to me. This was one of those learning things at ACDA that I didn't know, which is like, apparently we had never published a rubric, like out for people. So I got all kinds of emails about this, right? Some people are like, this is great. Other people, you're the devil. It was the same thing about COVID. But here's the deal on that. Like, first of all, I don't know how you can say before was better and this is worse, because how would you even know?
Right.
And the second thing is open and transparently what the priority of the conference committee was, right? So take it, leave it, but I feel strongly that at least it was public, right? But I do think one of the things that I saw, you said, I'm not sure how much of this stuff crossed your desk. All of it. Every bit of it. Not in the adjudication process. I'm very fly on the wall. I'm listening. I'm learning. I like to see what's happening. I'm very much a like how the sausage gets made kind of person. And this being my first national conference experience. And again, I think part of the reason that I was hired is to suss out some of these things. How are these things happening? What are new approaches that we might need? How do we preserve approaches that are working so they don't just get chunked out? I think that that's fundamentally part of the work that I'm supposed to be doing. So every bit of it. I did not see adjudicators' comments, but I read almost every intercession application and I listened to every auditioned choir submission. I did not weigh in on those things, but I did it because I wanted to be familiar with it.
How it all works.
Right. How does it work? Well, and when we say, like, what does the pool look like? What are people submitting? You know, but one of the things that I noticed is there are categories of presentations that do not fit well within the current adjudication structure. So that's why I asked earlier, like, where does vocal ped fit? If you're going to submit something on vocal pedagogy, where does it fit? And we have some fantastic professionals in vocal ped, right? Same thing when you think about literacy. There's all of these other pieces, let's say non-repertoire driven pieces. Where do those presentations live? One of the things that I wondered is there sort of a minimum number and a maximum number? Like, does junior high R&R get a certain number of slots? And it's like, maybe some years you fill all your slots, and maybe some years you don't, and those slots roll right over. But how does it work from a predominance of information, you know? And I would really like for us to spend some time sussing that out. So, for example, maybe we get more collegiate level presentations, which then just by sheer number would tell you may end up with more slots on the conference. We hear similar. What's fascinating to me is like almost every group says that they're not being served on the conference, and it's critical of another group being served on the conference, which is fascinating to me because I'm like, well, somebody's being served here. But like, I wonder about our music and worship folks.
Yes.
Right? And I really wonder about our music and worship folks when National Conference is scheduled to start on Ash Wednesday.
If your school or church are in the market for staging products like risers, shelves, podiums, movable platforms, all of the things that you need to set your choir up for success, I would like to strongly urge you to check out StageRight. StageRight's products are sturdy, they're durable, they're easy to use. I have personal experience with the acoustical shelves and some of the platforms that they have at StageRight, and I can tell you, compared to some of the more expensive competitors, they are a really great option to fit inside of a tight school budget, but also to give you the durability and usability that you need. So check out StageRight at stageright.com.
Right? That's an inherited problem.
Yep.
I can't do anything about that. I can tell you no conference in 2024 is scheduled against Ash Wednesday. I think when I hear people talking about that, it's like choral journal. I always want to say, like, right, we have two other publications, by the way, Core Teach and the International Journal for Research in Choral Singing. And like, there are bases of people who are publishing in here, and the Choral Journal doesn't have to be all things to all people.
Right.
Right? It doesn't need to be all things to all people. We have spaces, and people should feel very good about those spaces, right? Yeah. And I feel that way about conference as well. By the way, if you had to take a guess, how much of the membership do you think is conferencing?
Like as in going to the conference?
Yeah, any conference, region year or national year. What would your guess be?
Well, isn't it like usually about 3,000 people, at least before COVID? 10%? 15%?
It's less than 30%, no matter where you look.
Okay.
So.
Well, and only to ask you, I'll throw a question back at you, demographically anyway, for the organization. What percentage of the organization are K through 12 educators?
So let's talk about demographics collection as a whole, because I think it all matters. The first thing is ACDA has not been vigilant about collecting this information. So some information exists, but overall pretty limited. So what I would tell you is on somebody's membership record, we might have information on 50 or 60% of what's in the system. Who knows if it's accurate, right? People may have changed. Of that 50 or 60%, it's almost half and half collegiate K-12 currently. We have undertaken some really significant demographics collection initiatives for a couple of reasons. First of all, who are we serving? We should stop wondering, and we should find out. Because, for example, what we might find out is if the majority of membership has shifted to be K-12, that should tell us, it will tell us something. If the majority of the membership is college and university, that would tell us something too.
Yeah.
So I don't like to operate off of assumptions, particularly when we can put the data together. So people are going to see when you are renewing your membership, when are you doing these things, tell us. Please tell us. Go into your ACDA record. You can log in. You can add all that information today. Because if you want to be seen, that's one of the ways that I'm going to be able to see you is in the collection. We launched demographic collections on all of the applications for national conference. You saw it. You were an applicant. Everything from race, gender identification, sexual orientation, age, all of the things. Of course, prefer not to answer was always an option, but we required that you answer or choose prefer not to answer. Got a lot of feedback about this as well, interestingly enough. But here's what I would say. A year ago, and I had barely been here, not even 6 months, we had a region that had only male conductors on the performing choir slate. Okay?
Okay.
Now, lots of people had lots to say about this, but one of the questions that could not be answered is, what if there were only male applicants?
Or high percentage of them were, but we don't know.
But we couldn't answer the question. Because what I would tell you is, if we start with a diverse pool and we end up with a non-diverse pool, that is one root cause, and or a problem to address along the system from a diverse pool that is somehow resulting in a less diverse outcome. It's an entirely different problem to not even have a diverse pool to start with.
Which would require a different solution.
It would require a different solution. So when we're asking for those things, the adjudication committees are not seeing them. It is not disclosed or any of those things. I was very intentional with the language that I used when we added it to the applications, which said, this is why we're asking, this is what we're using it for, this is why we hope you will answer, because we're getting ready to publish the dashboards on all of those things. So I have the data set. So you want to know what the application pool looked like for auditioned choirs? We're going to put it out publicly.
Great.
Right? And because how will we know if we're making progress? We don't know until you have something to go from, right? There is also some research that tells us the second you start talking about it, the outcomes actually get better. Just by making it more transparent. You see this, I think, in a lot of now, particularly in higher education, where they'll post dashboards of candidate applications and all of those kinds of things. But it's going to tell us a lot. And one of the things is are there challenges along this adjudication pipeline? Which there may be. I suspect we don't have diverse enough pools to even start with. This is my own theory, which is there are, whatever the barriers are to even consider being in the pool are substantial enough. So maybe I'm worried that I can't fundraise enough money to make the trip. Maybe there is no way I think I can get a quote unquote quality recording. I'm worried about that being a barrier to me, right? I mean, who has the time? Whatever it is. And there is a sector of demographic that I think sometimes when we're talking about the diversity initiatives, that conversation very quickly kind of revolves typically around 2 points, gender and sexual orientation. And the scope for diversity is so much wider than that. We're talking about ableism. We're not talking about socioeconomic status. We're talking about all of these things. And so I think that we also have ageism. We have to talk about all of those parts when we're talking about the demographics of the organization.
That's good.
That's where we're going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's wonderful, and I'm excited to see that because those are definitely questions that I have. One of the things I notice around diversity, equity, inclusion conversations that kind of bothers me, partly because of the way my brain works, which is that I hear a lot of talk about it, but then I see oftentimes very little of what you just talked about, which is, and I'm glad we're doing that, which is, okay, so we're going to talk about percentages of XYZ population that are being represented in a certain space, but then I don't see the data of where it was and where it's going, and are we making progress? Is it getting better? If it's not getting better, then why? And if it is getting better, can we see that on paper? Like, is it, because we talk about it as if it's math, which I think has its own problems because people ultimately can't be boiled down to categories in a clean way that fits into a spreadsheet. But it's a starting point. Like, you got to talk. You got to talk about it.
We got to start somewhere,
right? Yeah, and I get that. And so I think it's good that if we're going to use those types of categories as inputs for the conversations we're having about it, then we have to also pony up the information about whether or not what we're doing or what we're saying we're doing is working.
Yeah. Well, and my attitude about that is the data is the membership's data.
Right.
It belongs to the membership. It may be some aspects of our history that, from an executive standpoint, I think that the direction and opinion of the executive has really set the trajectory of the organization. I'm obviously opinionated, Chris, obviously. My husband will tell you, and I'm a shrinking violet. No, he will not tell you that. But my best role as the executive is to activate the membership. ACDA is not Robyn Hilger. That would be a mistake.
Yeah.
That would be a mistake. Because and ACDA is in the elected leadership, which is all the way down to the state level. And I think it's really important that I do think that there's been a disconnection between the most grassroots work of the organization and the national office. And I think that there has been tremendous work that has been happening in the field at the state level. And I am hesitant to impose national level things down, because when you do that, you run the risk, like, you start imposing things from a national level at the expense of creativity and innovation. So that is what you sacrifice when you do those things. On the other hand, if you're carrying the ACDA brand, we are going to have to get to a place that whether your experience is in Pennsylvania or your experience is at National Conference in Cincinnati, that there is a congruency, right, between these things.
MyMusicFolders.com has the absolute best choir folders. They also have a new MyPad folder, so it's a folder for an iPad, which is all the rage right now in choral music. And you can also get a discount there when you shop for music folders and a variety of other classroom supplies at MyMusicFolders.com. Enter Choralosophy at checkout. I want to take us back real quick to 5 minutes ago in the conversation.
Where were we?
We were talking about the rubrics. We were talking about collecting demographics, and we were talking about how those things can serve some of the organization's goals of improving access and all of that. One is, yes, we covered already. I'm super excited that we're going to start keeping track of more of those demographics. I think that's really, really important. But there's also different, and you mentioned the idea about how if you find out that, say, a convention or a slate of performing choirs is not diverse, but if you find out that it's because the applicant pool was not diverse, well, then that's one problem, and that would take one type of solution, versus the finding out that it was a diverse pool, but we filtered it down to being a non-diverse, quote, slate of winners or whatever, right? And I think that needs to be, I want to zone in on that a little bit more with you, because I think that's really, really important, because when I talk about some of these topics on my show with a lot of guests, one of the themes that keeps coming back up is that sometimes we conflate those two problems with each other when we're talking about it. and that can cause its own kind of harm, because then I put this in the context of kids because I work with kids, and so all of my motivation to think about these things comes from kids that very well might be just like my kids, but because they're not being taught to do certain things, they're never going to be on the national convention stage, whereas my kids might be good enough to do that, but because of what I'm teaching them. But they're not genetically superior to the kids who are not being taught that in a different zip code down the road. And so understanding why those choirs from places that are not being represented, parts of the country, whether it be zip code or probably could be very well predicted by zip code, which of course correlates with race and other types of things in the United States. So knowing that kind of stuff is really important. And so when I come at some of the things about how, for me, teaching, improving the quality of the education that those students are getting is a long-term attempt to find solution to the equity problem.
Yes, the quality of the teacher at the front of the classroom is long recognized in research
Yes.
as a linchpin.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I guess the philosophical argument that I'm making, and I know this is not this, and I don't want you to ever think any of these things are an indictment against you. Some of the things that I've been making these arguments since before you came along to ACDA, but one of them is that it's a different philosophical approach to kind of look at the top tier of an art form or whatever it is, and that could go from who gets to perform at the national convention, who gets to be the clinician at XYZ, whatever, and try to make things equitable at that level, while ignoring what caused the disparity in the first place. I'm of the mind that I believe we do more good for more people in the long run by focusing on what happens at the ground. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you've got kids in entire school districts that aren't being taught what quarter notes are, and let's say that those kids are primarily black, then you're going to see that disparity at the upper levels in music. But if your mindset is, well, let's fix it at the top, then everybody responsible for that disparity at the bottom gets a free pass. Because then on paper we made it look like it was fair.
Oh, I agree. I think admittance to a school of music is a really great reference point. A reference point for this, because there's lots of talk about scholarship support and all of those kinds of things. But here's the fact of the matter, and we could have a whole nother episode about the Western-centric nature, right, of schools of music. That's an entirely different podcast.
Yep.
But from the baseline, a school of music is one of the few places on a college campus where you must be competent before you hit the door. When I auditioned on clarinet here at Oklahoma City University, I needed to know how to play the clarinet well. They were not going to teach me how to play the clarinet. Unlike other places on campus, if you're going into the School of Business, do you have to know how to read the financial statements before you take Economics 101? Probably not.
Why not?
Do you? Okay, a School of Music is so unique in that aspect. And the fact of the matter is, unless you have had access to high quality sequential music education, you can't even get in the door, even if there is scholarship and housing and everything else. You can't even get in the door. And that pipeline starts in many places, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade.
Right. But the approach, and that's a great example, because the approach oftentimes, though, is to say, well, the problem is with that collegiate academic or that collegiate admission process. And I would say, no, it's not, because you need to know those things. Mm-hmm. And the problem is in 4th grade. That if all of our effort, so in other words, I think it's a bias towards what's visible.
Oh, interesting. And I actually think the problem is both. That in that case, it is a both conversation, and if you're not working both, you're not going to actually see the results that you're
right. And I don't mean to
that you're
give the
hoping for.
impression that I'm just assuming that every college admissions process is fair and equitable.
No. But
I don't. But in other words, expecting kids to know about music before they get into a music school, I don't see that as necessarily a problem, because it is something that you do have to work at for years and years and years and years. And so, and just the idea that it would be a terribly expensive mistake for a kid who's not already been put through the ringer musically to show up to music school and pay $60,000 a year to find out they weren't really that good at it or didn't love it or whatever. So I actually think that I would push back a little bit in that I do want music schools to look for musicians that have already been trained. My concern is that not everybody's getting the opportunity to be trained.
Yes, 100%. But you see this in other academic areas as well. The number, I think I said earlier in the show, I worked college and career readiness for a period of time. And one of the indicators about persevering in college is how many remediation courses you have to take when you're a freshman. And so that tells you about academic preparation. So even if you can get admitted to college, if you are under academically prepared and now you're in all of these remediation courses where you're not getting credit and your degree is now off track, that is one of the number one giveaways for dropping out, is the number of remediation courses. So I think it would be the same here. We would say the same thing. A student who is unprepared musically would not be successful in a school of music. We talk about what the admission processes look like, genres of music that are acceptable to play for your audition, all of those kinds of things. That is one set of problems. But even being prepared up the chain is an entirely other problem. I'm going to stick to that one in and of itself is a both. It is an and thing. If you do all the preparation up the chain and we still have some of the concerns that currently exist around audition processes, then we haven't done a full job. And if we only address the collegiate level and we don't address the access along the way, we're still going to be no better off. It has to be both. The bylaws changes, I think, are a good place to talk about this. We have gendered terms in the R&Rs, right? We have women/SSAA, men's/TTBB. And I have gotten the question that says, can't we just change it? We just need to change it. Well, the answer is yes, but because bylaws are kind of tricky, which is it's kind of all or nothing. So if we could just change it, the other thing that we could just do is say, guess what? There's no more state chapters. Like literally, we'll get it ratified later. Like you're either compliant or you're not. There's nothing in the middle of the bylaws.
Right.
Now, but what we should do is address it directly within the policy documents of the organization, even if it means we're a year out from when, and we're more than a year. People have been talking about this for a long time. I've just been privy to it for a year, but it's coming up. It's good. You've got the purposes here, but it's coming up in the round 3. Consensus, I don't know that we're going to come to a consensus. I think the organization is very diverse. I think people need to be watching the bylaws vote because it really is going to matter. We launched the Diversity Initiatives column in the Choral Journal, Lift Every Voice. By the way, you got something to submit, send it to Ariane, please.
It's interesting because when you talk about what counts as a conversation or as content that would go in that column, that made me think of something too, which is that one of my, of course, everybody who listens to my show regularly already knows that I'm also very opinionated, and I have a lot of beefs with a lot of things about a lot of the ways people talk about things.
Contrarian.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Me too.
And partly because I see value in that. Like that every ecosystem needs to have somebody like that. Okay? Because if all we ever have are people around us who say, good job, way to go, then we're not, we're going to miss all kinds of things that we never would have had pointed out to us. And so to me, that's part of the diversity conversation, is also, well, it's the idea that opinions don't have skin colors and opinions don't have genders, right? It's the idea, like there's a lot of part of the diversity conversation is also perspective. It's also type of life experience. It's upbringing, it's religious upbringing versus a secular upbringing. There's all kinds of things, and again, because it kind of goes back to my comment earlier, where humans can't be put into a spreadsheet, and we miss a lot when we look at each other as boxes that we can check. And I, like I said before, I do acknowledge that there is a need to know certain demographic information about things, or else you don't know a bigger picture. But then at the same time, I think a lot of times people have trouble taking off their spreadsheet glasses and putting on their higher resolution lenses, where they're starting to see how truly kaleidoscopic diversity really is. And so, like for example, I've had a lot of conversations just about the idea that there is more than one way to be against racism, for example. There's more than one way to we were talking about this before, more than one way to approach a diversity problem in performing choirs. One way to talk about it would be admission to music schools. One way to talk about it would be what's going on with elementary school education at the foundation, right? There's more than one way to approach all of these things, and I think I think in order for a conversation to really be able to claim that it's a conversation about diversity, there has to be that has to be present, and then of course we get into the things you've said before, which is that there's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many things that we can talk about, right? And so one of the things that I think about a lot too with ACDA is that we, because all those things are true, there's I'll throw out some examples just to make it really concrete what I'm talking about. One of my many really controversial opinions is that I'm part of what a philosophical movement, I guess you could say, which would be into making sure that we are very conscious and careful with the way we think about these categorizations of ourselves. Is like if I'm going to talk about race, for example, I'm usually going to use terms like racialized as white, or racialized as black, because race doesn't exist. It's a social construct. And because I recognize things like the way, even things, I'll just tell you a story, a short one. I have a bunch of students in my school are what we are. They would check the box black, but they're Nigerian, from Cameroon, a lot of African immigrants. First generation, or their parents were born there or moved here. So it's a pretty robust Ethiopian students in my school, a lot of them. And when they get to the U.S., they're asked to check the box black, but they're not black. Like in their conceptualization of who they are and what they are, they're Nigerian or they're Ethiopian, or that's how they conceive of themselves. Another good example would be like, this is a common trope in somebody from the Dominican doesn't find out they're black till they get here. This happens all over the place, and I sometimes worry that we, as musicians, we should know this better than anybody, and sometimes I feel like we don't. And I think it's an American thing. It's a very uniquely American thing, but if on a rubric for, like, say, application to a convention, we're doing all kinds of math about like the diversity of our programs that we're putting forward, but then we're checking boxes like based on skin color and gender and all these other things that don't necessarily make our programs sound or look different. And it's kind of a really heady way to think about it, but I like to think about it this way. If I have a choral program written, and I've got composers that are maybe they could run the gamut of melanin shades, but they theoretically could all be culturally the same because they came from the same part of the country and went to the same schools and were educated in the same places. But I could have checked the boxes successfully on the rubric, and then ended up with a program of people who pretty much all come from the same place. And again, that kind of plays into the whole idea of the uniquely weird way we think about this in the U.S.
Well, yeah, completely ignoring intersectionality. That's what you're talking about.
Yes, in some ways, yes. Yeah. In some ways, yes. And of course, in fact, I'm glad you brought up intersectionality as a concept, because that's a really good way to kind of understand this. But I also sometimes feel like we misuse even that concept, which is that, like, its job. The whole reason intersectionality as a concept was invented was so that we could zoom out and look at disparities across populations and understand that it might be different to be, for example, a black woman versus just a black person. Your experience as a black woman might be different than as a black person, fill in the blank. And we need to be able to aggregate all that. But then at the same time, when I'm dealing with the actual individual person, intersectionality is really that word goes away, and it's individuality.
Yes, 100%.
Well,
and you were talking about the data from the spreadsheets. Data is only one point of information, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is why triangulation is so important. And so the data that we have will only give us a perspective that we haven't had. We would be making a huge mistake to think that it's going to say all, be all. But I do think that it's a missing point of information that we have. Just like, and I think that it's important, just like when we talk about the conference focus. Talking about conference takes up a huge amount of bandwidth in ACDA, but the data tells us that we're talking about 30% of the people who are there. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't mean we should do it less. That's not what I'm saying. I don't mean that we should do it less. I'm not trying to end conferences. Let me be very clear. I am not trying to end conferences, right, as I say. But it tells me about the opportunity that we're missing.
Yeah.
When we say place-based, the only way for you to get whatever this is for you to be place and time bound to whatever this is. And I have to tell you, I think that is a huge mistake when we look at what life is like here in this country now, particularly post-COVID, to say you must show up at this exact specific time and date to get this one thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, that 30 is kind of a tangent, but that 30% that you were talking about, does that lump together state, regional, and national? Like, these are people who would actually drive anywhere to a convention, or is that just national?
So the data set that I'm using is what is the year-over-year attendance at national conference versus the percentage of membership at the time.
Oh, I see. Okay.
What is the year-over-year attendance at region conferences by the membership in the region at that time? Mm-hmm. That's the data set.
I see. Okay. Yeah, and so I also wonder too, and this kind of ties back into the broader conversation, I think, which is that, like, who is ACDA serving? How do they feel? How do they know if they're feeling served or being served, or how would ACDA know if they feel that way? Those types of things, which is another data set that I wonder if you're interested in, or if you've ever thought about, is what percentage of people out there in the U.S. or any of the geographical areas that ACDA seeks to serve, what percentage of people who direct choirs are actually members? In other words, going outside of who is currently members, and who are we not reaching at all because they don't maybe see anything for them?
Yeah, I mean, hugely interested. The best place where some of that information, I think, exists already is in the lapsed member list of ACDA.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Right? The people who were once with us but aren't currently, right? Mm-hmm. And I truly believe that people vote with their feet and their money. That is how capitalism works.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So,
the best feature.
when when people are choosing you, that tells you something. And when people are not choosing you, that tells you something as well.
Yep.
Now, in the growth and transition of the organization, so for example, let's say we start to see more K-12 things all over the place. It is likely that we might see attrition at the collegiate level membership, right? So these things aren't static, right? They all impact each other. And I actually think we're going to have some really great incoming information. I made a specific request to the region presidents to be very active with their state leaders about what's happening in their state.
And I think, too, that you made the comment about how it could be that if more stuff was starting to happen for K-12, maybe there's attrition in collegiate. I would say that's possible, but I would say it's also possible that that doesn't happen. And here's what I mean. It's the idea that of a fixed pie versus a growable pie.
I'm with you. I was getting ready to say, it's not pie.
Yeah.
We're not going to run out.
Right. Meaning, but putting it in very concrete economic terms, if ACDA is able to reach, my suspicion is that there is there are a whole lot of K through 12 teachers who teach choirs as part of their job, but are not members because they don't see any reason to be. But if they were just putting it in the raw terms of money, if they were paying dues, that could increase the resources that ACDA has to offer things for everyone, not just the K through 12 people. And so the idea being that a rising tide lifts all boats kind of a thing, where it could be beneficial for collegiate people also to have more access to networking and stuff, convention stuff, but also online content like you're talking about. So I agree with you that it really doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And I think about that too a lot with the, with just everything that we're talking about related to diversity also. I'm very much of a, always wanting to point out the fact that the pie is growing, and whether or not we're keeping track of, what is our rubric for success in all of these things. If our rubric for success is here is a pie, and right now this percentage, this group is getting this chunk, and this group is getting this chunk, and this group is getting this chunk. If we could only make it so that this group was getting this much more of the pie, then we'd be successful. And I just see that as the wrong mentality. The success is the pie growing, and maybe we don't have to micromanage all of who's getting what if everyone's growing, if that makes sense.
It 100% grow 100% makes sense, because I think that anybody who has been in a marginalized position will tell you that they don't want to be that person. So for example, let's say we said, oh, well, we better hire a woman to be the conductor. No woman wants that job.
Right.
I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Yep. Nobody. That's not the way. That's not the way.
Yeah.
That to get the job done.
Yep.
Right. So I think, that I totally agree with you there. We are talking about, and I've written about this in my column and the Choral Journal and stuff. We're always having an and conversation. There isn't anything about anything in ACDA right now. This is my perspective that's happening that says we're chunking this out for this. Now, nobody said don't sing the standard canon. Nobody said that. Nobody said take Bach off your program. Nobody said stuff. So I said, maybe do that and, right?
Yes. No, you're right. It should be an and conversation. Although the or conversation is out there, and it is disturbingly prevalent. I mean, it is and this is kind of takes us into a slightly different area, which is just the one of my pet peeves, which is the online conversation about all these things. But it is a totally acceptable thing in online spaces to say something like, well, we're not going to do Bach anymore because white cis male composers are out.
Well, that's a disservice to students, because
yes,
it's within history It's within history. It's within the repertoire that they're going to need to know. Just because new repertoire is on the horizon doesn't mean the old repertoire is out.
Correct.
Right? And I really believe it's fundamentally a disservice. There are pieces of repertoire, and I think some of this is maybe more in the choral niche than we do see in instrumental, where the text itself is questionable. Right? The text itself has aged in its relevancy and its application.
Oh, I'll tell you some stories about that at dinner. Because I cleaned out a 100-year-old choir library.
Yeah. And I think that happens maybe more in choral world than it does
we deal with text.
In an instrumental world. So I am not going to be a champion of saying, let's keep those things in the repertoire. Absolutely not.
Right.
But when we're talking about taking Bach out or Brahms or any of those things, no.
Well, it comes. No, you're right, and I agree with you. But it comes. I think that's really this might be where we finish this conversation, because I think it perfectly distills what my criticism is of the idea of making sure that we remember that when we look at percentage of access by immutable characteristics, that we are only looking through one lens, and that's an important lens. But we have to also remember that we have to take it off, because I think that's what leads to people coming to that conclusion. It's when they don't know how to take off those glasses, and then they see that the classical music world is white dominant. So it's a logical solution that, well, one way we could do that is we could take white people out and take Bach out and maybe we shouldn't have to learn Mahler because he was a white guy. Okay, well, but that's not why people learn his music. It's his immutable characteristics were not poured onto that page. It was his human soul, and so we forget that. And I think I think that's why we forget it, is because we talk so much about our portions of the pie, and then we forget to take off that lens and use our human lens, the lens that allows us to see each other as individuals, that would make me say, well, when I listen to Bach, I'm not listening to a white man. I'm listening to his soul. I'm listening to his human soul. And because I think, and it's that conclusion, though, that I think is one of our critical errors that we're facing. And I think it does happen more in choral music than it does in instrumental music, and it probably does happen in instrumental music as well. But I think it happens a lot in choral music because we do have that text element as well, and so we can also more explicitly deal with the stories, the narratives of our lives and our different experiences, and so I think that's one of the problems that I see, is that you can go on the internet and say something, even in a choir director group, about let's do less white guy music, and have that not seen as just a bizarre way to think about music, rather than what should happen, in my opinion, which is that people are lovingly redirected back to the whole point of diversity conversation in the first place, which is to get everybody in a room together making music. Like, that's the whole point of it, and those types of comments don't do that.
Right. Well, and you end up causing the same problem that you're just trying to avoid.
Yep.
Right. We're talking about a conversation of othering. So we have pieces, composers, people who have been othered. Then the pendulum swings. Now we begin to other others, right? I think the conversation comes back more centric, right? Which is, it is all of these things. If you ate a diet of macaroni and cheese all day, every day, you might be in heaven for the first week, but then your taste buds are going to get unhappy, and your body is going to get unhappy, and everything is going to get unhappy, right? Variety is the spice of life. That's what they say. I think it is a responsibility as a teacher. I think one of the ways that the conversation kind of devolves is the fact that we have to acknowledge that maybe we don't have a command of the repertoire to be as expansive as we would like to be, to be in a position to be a learner again. And we have to make that okay. We have to make it okay to say, you know, I do want to expand the repertoire offering. I'm really only familiar with, right, we do unto others as what was done to us, right? So what I grew up doing, what I studied, and all of these things. And now where has my opportunity been to learn, explore? I think people are extraordinarily afraid of making mistakes. So if I'm going to take on a performance, I want to make sure that I'm not offending someone or any of those things. So how can we continue to find spaces where people can openly say, I do not know how to do X and I would like to do it better? How you know, in doing something like that, I'm conscientiousness of the burden that places on culture bearers and other people as well. I think we have to be really careful about who is doing that lift. And I don't know yet about that, but it is something that kind of weighs on me where you say, okay, if we want more articles about diverse things and all these things, let's have all of these culture bearers write these things and do these things. I think that's a misplaced burden in some respects. So I think that we have to be careful. And I think the most important piece, Chris, is to genuinely pursue to just generally always be on the pursuit of knowledge and to be open and kind. So when somebody gives you feedback that says, hey, maybe it's not that, like, they don't hate you. You're not the worst person ever. You could also deliver that message kindly as well. Like, hey, I suspect you are a person who would want to know this, and this. I know I always appreciate those things. And so, but it's also easy for me to say that because I am not a person who has experienced a ton of marginalization overall, although being a female CEO is an interesting prospect. That's an entirely different podcast as well. But I would like to see more curiosity. You know, when the conversation's starting to get hot, I'm inclined to get more curious about it, to ask more questions, to lean in rather than getting offended by it, and to say, help me learn. Please keep talking to me about this. I'm trying to understand. Really engaging there. I also recognize that I have a pretty high tolerance for conflict. My family is a family of arguers. I think everything is negotiable. A lot of times conflict does not register to me. I think we're just having a conversation, not fighting. I don't think we're fighting.
I'm that way too.
So that's an advantage and a disadvantage. But the membership is not only the people who are elected. I mean, the membership is broad. And I think that we have a lot more people who have a lot to say that we aren't hearing from.
Yes, I agree. That's why I wanted to have this conversation. And because that's what I'm hearing is that, and I think it's, it is I'm glad you mentioned the loudest voices on Facebook, because I think that's because of how much of our professional interaction has been pushed into that space, that has created the impression that that's what's driving everything, is that ACDA is run by Facebook groups. And that impression has been there since before you got here. But I think that hearing you lay that out is really important for people to hear, because yes, it is true that ACDA is a membership organization, and we vote for things, we become engaged in things or not, and we can make the organization what it is that we want it to be. So that's awesome. Robyn, I appreciate this. This has been fun.
Oh my gosh, I've had such a great time.
I know, this is fun.
Chris?
This is nerding out.
It is nerding out. Of course, I love ACDA. I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad that we have members like you and so many others who are in the trenches, serving, doing all those things. I like, just so you know, I like the rabble browsers. Those are my people. There's a specific personality type that's called disruptors. I am one too. So I try to use my powers for good and not for evil.
Right.
As a disruptor, it's something that I've come to just sort of accept about myself. And I really appreciate a really good intellectual conversation about really important things. And then the next step to that is, what do we do about it?
Yep.
So we have to move from conversation to action quickly. That's the other thing about data. Data is a thing. It's flat on the paper. It's the thing that has to come out of that is the what's next. We can't lose sight of those things. So
as long as we're looking at the data with the right glasses.
All the glasses. You say the right glasses. I think there are multiple ones. It depends on what you're trying to learn, what the question is. But I appreciate the opportunity. Members can always reach out to me, executivedirector@acda.org. I answer my own email. Give me a few days, people. Sometimes I get a lot, but I always try to answer. It's most helpful when I understand the context of the concern. So something just like, ACDA is the worst thing ever is not super helpful to me. Although it could be true to that person's perspective. But I would like to understand more about it.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Cool. All right.
Let's see.
Yes, that was fun. Thank you all for listening to the end of the episode. That was a little bit of a longer one, but like I said, I left quite a bit on the cutting room floor because I could just talk to Robyn all day. I consider Robyn a friend now. We had so much fun, and I hope that you found this episode thought-provoking and helpful as you think about where you fit in and how your voice might become part of the choral landscape through ACDA or other organizations that you belong to. If you enjoyed this episode, like, share, leave a review, leave comments on the Facebook page, join Choralosopher's Facebook page as well, and of course don't forget to head to patreon.com/Choralosophy and subscribe there. I really rely on that support. That is the MVP team for the Choralosophy podcast. Thanks, everybody.